A homeless widow inherited a workshop sealed for 50 years for just $6. What she found hidden in the walls would not only make her rich, but it would also unravel a family secret that changed an entire town. If you've ever felt like you've lost everything, or if you believe that second chances can be found in the most unexpected places, then this story is for you. Stick with me, and maybe even subscribe, because we're going to unpack what it really means to find a home. The day my life ended for the second time. It was raining. A cold, miserable November drizzle that clung to the windows of Mr. Thorne's law office, blurring the world outside into a watercolor of gray and despair. The first time my life ended had been 18 months prior, in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and fading hope, when I held my husband Liam's hand as it grew cold. This second ending felt quieter, more bureaucratic. It was the simple, soul-crushing finality of a signature on a piece of paper. With a flick of a cheap ballpoint pen, I signed away the house we had bought, the garden we had planted, the future we had dreamed of. The medical debt was a tide that had finally pulled our whole world under. I was officially homeless. Mr. Thorne, a man whose face seemed permanently carved into an expression of gentle melancholy, slid another document across the polished mahogany of his desk. "And this," he said, his voice a low, dry rustle like old leaves, "is the other matter, the Havenwood property." I stared at the paper without seeing it. My entire world had been condensed into the worn-out backpack at my feet and the 10-year-old sedan parked outside, a car that was now my bedroom, kitchen, and closet. Another piece of paper felt like an insult. "I don't understand," I managed, my voice hoarse. Liam never mentioned a workshop. He never even talked about his grandfather. "Arthur Vance was an eccentric," Mr. Thorne said, choosing his words with the care of a man defusing a bomb. "From what I can gather, he and his son, Liam's father, had a significant falling out. When Arthur passed, he left this property in a rather peculiar trust. The lease was prepaid for 50 years. The cost, recorded in the town ledger, was $6. The terms stipulated it could not be sold, transferred, or entered until the full 50-year term had expired. That term expired last Tuesday." He let that sink in. 50 years. $6. It sounded like a fairy tale or a joke. "The property now passes to his last living heir. That's you, Ilara, through Liam." He tapped a clause on the document with a clean, clipped fingernail. "The town of Havenwood, however, considers the building derelict. It's been condemned. You have 90 days to either bring it up to code or they will seize the property and demolish it. The land will be sold to developers. They've already made a preliminary offer, assuming you'll want to be rid of it." He slid a second folder toward me. It contained a check for $5,000. "They're willing to pay the back taxes and offer you this for a quick signature. It's not much, but given your circumstances..." His voice trailed off, a gesture of professional pity. $5,000. It was more money than I'd had in one place since the last of our savings had been drained. It was enough for a deposit on a small apartment, enough to stop sleeping in my car, enough to feel human again for a month or two. It was the sensible choice, the only choice. But something held me back. Liam. He had spent his last year fighting, truly fighting, not just the illness, but the despair. He kept drawing little sketches in his notebooks, designs for furniture he wanted to build, plans for a life he knew he wouldn't get to live. He never gave up. Taking this money felt like giving up on him all over again. "Where is it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Havenwood. It's about a 4-hour drive north from here, tucked away in the mountains. Not much there anymore." I looked at the pen in my hand. One signature would give me a brief, fleeting sense of security. The other led to a derelict building in a forgotten town, a place connected to a family I never knew and a husband I desperately missed. It was a dead end, It was illogical. "I'll take the keys," I said. Mr. Thorne blinked, his professional composure momentarily fractured by surprise. He studied my face for a long moment, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. He opened a drawer and pulled out a small, tarnished brass key attached to a faded paper tag. On the tag, in faint, spidery handwriting, were 2 words: "The workshop." He didn't try to talk me out of it. He just explained that the $6 fee from 1974 was still technically unpaid due to some clerical limbo. To make the transfer ironclad, I owed the town of Havenwood $6. I slid my last $10 bill across the desk. He solemnly placed $4 in change into my hand. The weight of those 4 single bills felt heavier than the check for $5,000 ever could. I had just purchased my only possession on earth, a broken-down, condemned building I had never seen. It was the most terrifying and hopeful thing I had ever done. The drive north was a slow, deliberate severing of ties. Each mile I put between myself and the city was a mile further from the ghost of my old life. The relentless gray drizzle of the city gave way to a fine, persistent mist as I climbed into the foothills. The superhighways narrowed into 2-lane roads that wound through dense forests of pine and skeletal birch. The air grew colder, cleaner, smelling of wet earth and wood smoke. My car, which had felt like a prison for the past week, started to feel more like a protective shell, a small bubble of warmth and familiar smells carrying me toward an absolute unknown. I thought about Liam. I thought about the way he used to grip the steering wheel, his knuckles white with excitement, whenever we'd go on a road trip. He'd point out old barns and strange rock formations, weaving stories about the people who might have lived there. He had a way of seeing the history in a place, the life hidden beneath the surface of things. What would he think of this? Driving toward his grandfather's ghost, a man he'd never met, to claim a building that was probably just a pile of rotten wood. He'd probably find it hilarious, a grand, absurd adventure. The thought brought the first genuine smile to my face in weeks, a fragile thing that felt like a tiny crack of light in a dark room. As the sun began to dip below the jagged line of the mountains, casting long, deep blue shadows across the road, I saw the sign, "Welcome to Havenwood, population 312. The paint was peeling, and one of the posts had a significant lean to it, as if the sign itself was tired of standing. The town was nestled in a small valley, a scattering of lights just beginning to flicker on against the encroaching twilight. It looked quiet. It looked still, like a place time had largely decided to ignore. Mr. Thorne had given me a hand-drawn map on the back of a legal envelope. "Main Street. Turn right at the old gas station, the one with the rusty pump. Follow that road till it turns to dirt. It's the last building on the left. You can't miss it." The gas station looked like it had pumped its last gallon sometime during the Nixon administration. I made the turn, my headlights cutting a swath through the deepening gloom. The paved road ended abruptly, and the car bumped onto a gravel track that was more potholes than road. And there it was. Set back from the road, half swallowed by overgrown ivy and the shadows of towering pine trees, stood the workshop. It was larger than I had imagined, a 2-story structure made of dark, weathered wood and local stone. Its roof sagged in the middle like a tired old man's back. The windows were boarded up, and a massive, padlocked door, sealed with a thick sheet of rusted metal, faced the road. It didn't look derelict. It looked defiant. It looked like it was waiting. I killed the engine. The sudden silence was immense, broken only by the frantic ticking of the cooling engine and the sound of my own breathing. For a long time, I just sat there, in the driver's seat, staring at the building. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at me. This was a mistake. A huge, idiotic, grief-fueled mistake. I should have taken the money. I could be looking at apartment listings right now, drinking a hot cup of coffee in a warm diner. Instead, I was in the middle of nowhere, with $4 to my name, staring at a building that was probably home to more raccoons than secrets. But then I saw the key on the passenger seat, glinting faintly in the dashboard light. It wasn't just a key. It was a promise I had made to myself in that lawyer's office. A promise to not give up. I took a deep breath, the cold mountain air stinging my lungs, and opened the car door. The sound echoed in the stillness. This was it. The first step. The rest of the journey was hidden behind that sealed door. Whatever was inside, good or bad, it was mine now. The air was bitingly cold, raising goosebumps on my arms beneath my thin jacket. The ground was soft and damp, a carpet of pine needles meeting my footsteps as I approached the workshop. Up close, it was even more imposing. The wood of the walls was thick, heavy timber, scarred by decades of wind and snow. The ivy that climbed its sides was like a gnarled green skin, its tendrils reaching into every crack and crevice. The place smelled of pine and damp stone, and something else, something fainter, a hint of linseed oil and sawdust, a ghost of work long past. The main door was a formidable obstacle. A thick, rusted padlock secured a heavy iron hasp. Below it, a sheet of tin had been crudely nailed over the seam of the double doors, and stamped into the metal was a faded, but still official-looking, seal from the Havenwood County Clerk's Office, dated November 14, 1974. 50 years and a day ago. It felt like I was breaking into a pharaoh's tomb. Mr. Thorne had given me a pair of bolt cutters along with the key. "You'll need these," he'd said with a dry little smile. They felt heavy and brutally functional in my hands. The chain of the padlock was thick, and it took all my weight leaning into the handles before it gave way with a sharp, ugly snap that echoed in the silent valley. The sound felt like a violation. The lock fell to the ground with a dull thud. Next was the tin sheet. I had a crowbar in my car's emergency kit, a tool Liam had insisted we keep. I wedged the tip under the edge of the metal and pried. The nails screeched in protest as they pulled free from the old wood, one by one. Finally, the sheet came loose, and I tossed it aside. Now only the door's original lock remained. My hand was shaking as I inserted the small brass key. It slid in smoothly, a perfect fit after half a century. I turned it. There was a faint click, a sound so small and yet so momentous as the tumblers aligned. I gripped the cold iron handle, took a breath, and pulled. The door groaned. It resisted, scraping against a floor warped by time and humidity. I had to put my shoulder into it, pushing with all my might until it finally gave way, opening just enough for me to slip through into the darkness beyond. The air that rushed out to meet me was thick, cool, and utterly still. It was the smell of a sealed space, a potent combination of dust, dry rot, aging wood, and the sharp, clean scent of turpentine. It was the smell of preserved time. I stood just inside the threshold, my eyes struggling to adjust to the gloom. The only light came from the sliver of the open door, and a few faint beams piercing through cracks in the boarded-up windows, illuminating swirling motes of dust in the air. Slowly, the interior began to take shape. I was in a vast, open space with a soaring ceiling, crisscrossed by heavy wooden beams. A massive workbench ran almost the entire length of one wall, its surface littered with the ghostly shapes of tools and half-finished projects, all shrouded in a thick, uniform blanket of gray dust. Saws and chisels hung from pegs on the wall, their steel outlines still visible. Jars filled with what might have been screws or nails or pigments sat in orderly rows on high shelves. It was a place of creation, frozen in the middle of a thought. To my right, a narrow staircase led up to a loft. To my left, a small, glass-paned door led to what looked like an office. The glass was so clouded with grime I could barely see through it. Everything was covered in that same 50-year layer of dust, a soft, silent testament to abandonment. It wasn't the den of raccoons I had feared. It was a sanctuary, a perfectly preserved moment. I walked deeper inside, my boots leaving the first footprints in the dust in half a century. I ran my hand over the surface of the workbench, the fine powder soft as velvet under my fingertips. Beneath it, The wood was solid oak, scarred and stained from years of use. I could almost feel the presence of the man who had worked here. Arthur Vance, Liam's grandfather, my grandfather-in-law, a complete stranger whose entire world I had just inherited. I found a light switch on the wall, a thick, old-fashioned toggle switch. On a whim, I flipped it. Nothing happened. Of course, the power would have been cut decades ago. I went back to my car and retrieved a powerful flashlight. Its beam cut through the darkness, making the dust motes dance like frantic, tiny stars. With the light, I could see the details. The incredible order beneath the chaos of abandonment. Tools were not just hung, they were arranged by size. The jars on the shelves were labeled in a neat, elegant script. This was the workspace of a meticulous, patient man. On the far wall, something large was covered by a heavy canvas dropcloth. I approached it slowly, my heart thumping. It felt like another threshold, another secret to uncover. I took a corner of the cloth, heavy and stiff with age, and pulled it back. Underneath was a lathe, but it was unlike any I had ever seen. It was a complex, beautiful machine of brass and steel, intricate and ornate, looking more like a scientific instrument from a Jules Verne novel than a woodworking tool. It was clearly custom-built, a masterpiece of engineering. And next to it, on a small stand, was a half-finished wooden sphere, still clamped in the machine, with delicate, complex patterns carved into its surface. Arthur Vance hadn't just been a woodworker, he had been an artist, an inventor. I spent the next few hours exploring, moving slowly, deliberately, trying to absorb the story this place was telling me. The main floor was for work, for creation. I climbed the creaking stairs to the loft. It was a storage area, filled with neatly stacked lumber of all kinds, oak, cherry, walnut, maple, all of it perfectly seasoned, worth a small fortune on its own. There were also wooden crates, sealed and stenciled with dates from the early 1970s. Finally, I turned my attention to the small office. The door opened with a groan. Inside it was Spartan. A heavy wooden desk, a straight-backed chair, and a wall of built-in shelves filled with books. Unlike the workshop, the office felt more personal. I ran the beam of my flashlight over the book spines. They were books on engineering, astronomy, clockmaking, philosophy, and poetry. A complex man. On the desk sat a single object, a small, intricately carved wooden box. It wasn't locked. My fingers trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was not a treasure, but a single, folded piece of paper. It was a letter. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was the same elegant script from the jars. It began with 2 words that made my breath catch in my throat. To whoever follows. This wasn't just a workshop, it was a message, a time capsule. And I was the one who had just opened it. My hands shook as I unfolded the brittle, yellowed paper. The letter was short, the handwriting a testament to a steady, deliberate hand. To whoever follows, it began. If you are reading this, then 50 years have passed, and I am long gone. This place was my life's work. Not the things in it, but the work itself. I have sealed it not to hide a fortune, but to protect an idea. Time is the only true guardian of some things. Do not trust the surface of what you see. The walls have more to say than the tools. Look for the unbalanced gear. I read the lines again. The walls have more to say than the tools. Look for the unbalanced gear. It was a riddle. A clue. My mind, numb with grief and exhaustion for so long, sparked with a flicker of genuine curiosity. This was more than just a strange inheritance. It was a puzzle left by a man I'd never met, a man whose blood ran in my husband's veins. I spent the rest of that first night in my car, parked just outside the workshop doors. I couldn't bring myself to sleep inside, not yet. It still felt like his space, not mine. I kept the flashlight on, reading the short letter over and over again, the words imprinting themselves on my mind. The unbalanced gear. The next morning, I woke to the chirping of birds and the sight of sunlight filtering through the tall pines. The world felt different. I had a purpose, however strange and uncertain. I had a puzzle to solve. I made a promise to myself. I would use the 90 days the town had given me. I wouldn't just clean this place up, I would understand it. I would find out what Arthur Vance had been trying to protect. My first task was practical. I needed to make the space livable. I drove into what passed for the town center of Havenwood, a single street with a diner, a hardware store, a post office, and a small grocery. It felt like stepping back in time. I used some of the meager cash I had to buy a heavy-duty respirator mask, gloves, buckets, and cleaning supplies at the hardware store. The man behind the counter, a grizzled old-timer named Jeb, eyed me with open curiosity. "You're the one who took the old Vance place," he said. It wasn't a question. News, it seemed, traveled fast in a town of 312 people. "I am," I said, my voice muffled by the collar of my jacket. "Heard the developers want it. Offering good money." He squinted at me. "You'd be smart to take it. That place is a teardown." "I'm just going to clean it out first," I lied. He grunted, a sound that could have meant anything, and rang up my supplies. As he handed me my change, he paused. Arthur was a strange one, kept to himself. But he was a genius. The things he could make, they were like magic. He shook his head, a flicker of old memory in his eyes. "Be careful in there. A place left alone that long holds on to things." His words stayed with me as I returned to the workshop. Holds on to things. I started by tackling the dust. It was a monumental task. I opened the main doors wide, letting the fresh, cold air and sunlight stream in for the first time in 5 decades. I put on my mask and began to sweep, starting from the back and working my way forward. The dust rose in thick, choking clouds, ancient air disturbed from its long slumber. It took 2 full days of sweeping, wiping, and scrubbing just to get the main floor to a point where I could breathe without a mask. As I cleaned, I searched. I examined every tool, every workbench, every shelf. I was looking for a gear, an unbalanced one. I found dozens of gears of all shapes and sizes, in boxes, in drawers, on shelves. Many were parts of complex, half-assembled mechanisms that looked like the insides of enormous clocks or automatons. I checked each one. None of them seemed deliberately unbalanced. The work was physically exhausting, but mentally clarifying. With every inch of grime I scrubbed away, I felt like I was also clearing away some of the fog in my own head. The rhythm of the work, sweep, scrub, lift, carry, was a meditation. It kept the grief at bay. I was too tired at the end of each day to do anything but fall into a deep, dreamless sleep in my car. After a week, the workshop was transformed. Sunlight now streamed through clean windows, illuminating the rich grain of the wooden walls and the beautiful, strange machinery. It was no longer a tomb. It was a workspace waiting for its craftsmen. But I was no closer to solving the riddle. I turned my attention to the office. I carefully wiped down the books, the desk, the shelves. I sat in Arthur's chair, trying to see the room as he saw it. My eyes kept drifting to the walls. The walls have more to say than the tools. The office walls were paneled in dark, rich walnut. I started tapping, listening for a hollow sound. Nothing. I ran my hands over every inch of the paneling, searching for a seam, a hidden latch, a trick panel. Still nothing. Frustrated, I leaned back in the chair and stared at the wall opposite the desk. It was dominated by a large, built-in shelving unit filled with books. My gaze drifted over the spines, and then I saw it. It wasn't a gear made of metal or wood. It was a design, a symbol. Tooled in gold leaf on the spine of a thick, leather-bound book on celestial mechanics was a small, intricate drawing of a clockwork gear system. And in the very center of the design One of the gears was drawn with a single tooth that was slightly, almost imperceptibly, longer than the others. The unbalanced gear. My heart hammered in my chest. I pulled the heavy book from the shelf. It wasn't a book, it was a box, cleverly disguised. The spine was attached to a wooden container hollowed out from the pages of a real book. As I lifted it, I felt a faint click from behind the bookshelf. A low, grinding sound followed, and a section of the bookshelf next to where the book had been slowly swung inward, revealing a dark, narrow opening in the wall. I stared, dumbfounded, at the hidden doorway. Jeb at the hardware store was right. Arthur Vance's work was like magic. Taking my flashlight, I stepped through the opening. It was a small, closet-sized space, completely hidden within the walls of the office. And in the center of that space, on a simple wooden pedestal, sat a large, heavy, metal strongbox. On top of the box was a thick, leather-bound journal. This was it. This was what Arthur had sealed the workshop to protect. I carried the journal and the strongbox out into the light of the office and set them on the desk. The strongbox was locked with a combination dial, but the journal was open to the first page. The same elegant script. But this was no riddle. This was his story. My name is Arthur Vance, it began, and if you are reading this, it means you have found my heart. Not the organ that beats in my chest, but the work that gave it a reason to beat. The world outside values the wrong things. It values speed over patience, profit over beauty, noise over silence. I could not let my work be devoured by that world. Not yet. I sat down in his chair, the dusty leather creaking under my weight, and began to read. For the next several hours, I didn't move. The sun arced across the sky, and the workshop filled with the golden light of late afternoon, but I didn't notice. I was completely lost in Arthur's world, in his words, in the story of a life lived in quiet, brilliant defiance. The journal was his confession, his manifesto, and his last will and testament all rolled into one. He wrote not just of his work, but of his life, his love, and his profound disappointment with the world his son had chosen to embrace. He had been a horologist, a master clockmaker, but his passion went beyond mere timekeeping. He saw clockwork as a metaphor for the universe itself, a complex, beautiful, interconnected system. He wasn't just building clocks, he was building mechanical poems about time, space, and memory. His creations, which he called tempora, were not for sale. They were his children, his legacy. He wrote about his son, Thomas, Liam's father. Thomas had been a brilliant boy, but he was impatient, drawn to the allure of the city, of fast money and modern business. He saw his father's workshop not as a place of magic, but as a dusty relic. He wanted Arthur to patent his designs, to mass-produce them, to become rich. Arthur refused. He believed that to mass-produce his work would be to strip it of its soul. Their disagreement became a chasm, a deep and bitter rift that was never healed. Thomas left Havenwood at 18, vowing never to return. They never spoke again. He called me a fool, Arthur wrote, his handwriting tighter, angrier on this page. He said I was burying my genius in the dirt of this forgotten town. Perhaps he was right. But I would rather be a fool who protects a single beautiful thing than a king who sells the world's soul for a piece of gold. The journal then detailed his decision to seal the workshop. He was growing old. He had no apprentice, no one to pass his knowledge to. He feared that upon his death, Thomas would return, sell everything to the highest bidder, and his life's work would be scattered, dismantled, and lost forever. So he devised a plan. He used a legal loophole to create the 50-year lease, a period long enough, he hoped, for the world to either forget him completely or, perhaps, for someone worthy to appear. Someone who wouldn't see the workshop as a commodity, but as a calling. I leave it to fate, he wrote on the final page. Or perhaps to blood. Maybe a grandchild I will never know will one day stand in this room and understand. The combination to the strongbox is a date, the only day that ever mattered. The day I met my Eleanor, October 23rd, 38. I closed the journal, my eyes blurry with tears. I cried for Arthur, for his lonely genius and his broken heart. I cried for the feud that had stolen a father from his son and a grandfather from his grandson. And I cried for Liam, who had never known this incredible man, this artist, this philosopher who was his kin. Liam, with his love for building things, for seeing the story in old wood, he would have understood. He would have loved this place. He would have loved Arthur. I turned to the strongbox. My fingers, still trembling, spun the dial. Right to 10. Left past it to 23. Right to 38. I pulled the handle. The heavy door swung open with a well-oiled whisper. My breath caught in my throat. I had expected. I don't know what I expected. Blueprints? Deeds? But it was cash. Stacks and stacks of old bills, neatly bundled with paper bands. It wasn't a king's ransom, but it was far more than I had ever seen. I counted a small stack. It was $10,000. And there were at least 10 such stacks in the box. $100,000. Maybe more. It was life-changing money. It was enough to solve all my problems, to leave this town and start over anywhere I wanted. But that wasn't all. Beneath the stacks of cash were several velvet-lined trays. I lifted the first one. It was filled with his finished works, small, intricate marvels of clockwork. One was a pocket watch, but when I opened the cover, it wasn't a clock face inside. It was a miniature, three-dimensional orrery with tiny gemstone planets orbiting a sunstone in perfect, silent harmony. Another was a small wooden bird that, when a lever was pressed, flapped its wings, turned its head, and opened its beak, a tiny, perfect piece of mechanical life. They were breathtaking. They were priceless. And at the very bottom of the box was a thick envelope with my name on it. Ilera. My blood ran cold. How was that possible? He had died decades before I was even born. I tore it open. Inside was not a letter from Arthur, but from Liam. His familiar, messy scrawl filled the page. My dearest Ilera, it began. If you are reading this, I am so sorry. It means I'm gone, and it means I never got the chance to tell you this myself. I found this place. I found the journal. I solved the puzzle. I did it about a year before I got sick. I was looking for answers about my family, and I found him. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the paper. Liam had been here. He had stood in this room. He had found the journal, the strongbox, everything. I didn't know what to do, the letter continued. The money. I wanted to use it for us, to pay for my treatment, to save our house. But Arthur's journal, it felt wrong. This wasn't just money, it was a test. He left it for someone who would understand. I was so afraid that if I used it, I would be just like my father, the son he was so disappointed in. I was afraid of failing him, this grandfather I'd never met. So I put it all back, all of it. I added the only thing I had of value, my hope for you. I wrote your name on the envelope, and I sealed the strongbox again. I made a choice. I chose to bet on you. This is your inheritance now, not mine. His legacy and my love. You are the one he was waiting for, Alara. You have the purest heart of anyone I have ever known. You see the beauty in things, not their price. Do what you think is right. Build something. Create something. Don't let his magic die. Don't let our love die. Live. Please, just live. I couldn't breathe. The letter fell from my fingers. A wave of grief so powerful it buckled my knees crashed over me. I collapsed onto the dusty floor of that office, clutching the letter to my chest, and I sobbed. I sobbed for Liam, for his impossible, beautiful, heartbreaking choice. He had been sitting on a fortune that could have saved him, could have saved us. But he chose to honor a ghost. He chose to believe in me. The weight of that love, that faith, was crushing and liberating all at once. He hadn't abandoned me to poverty. He had left me a key, not just to a workshop, but to a new life, a new purpose. He had left me the hardest and most beautiful choice of all. I lay there on the floor for what felt like hours, the dust motes dancing in the fading light, until the tears finally subsided, leaving behind a strange and profound calm. I knew what I had to do. I wasn't going to run. I was going to stay. I was going to fight. I was going to build. The emotional storm passed, leaving in its wake a quiet, resolute clarity. I carefully folded Liam's letter and placed it inside my jacket, against my heart. I felt its physical presence there for the rest of the day, a constant, reassuring warmth. I looked around the office, at the strong box filled with money and mechanical wonders, at Arthur's journal, at the desk where two brilliant, stubborn men had, in their own ways, poured out their souls. This was more than a building now. It was a trust, a legacy passed from a grandfather to a grandson, and from a husband to a wife. And it was my turn to be its guardian. Just as that resolve was solidifying, a sharp, official-sounding knock echoed from the main doors. It made me jump. I walked out of the office and saw a man in a crisp suit standing in the open doorway, silhouetted against the bright afternoon light. He held a clipboard and had a thin, impatient smile. "Ma'am?" he called out, his voice echoing slightly in the large space. "My name is Mr. Davison. I'm from the Sterling Development Group. I believe our legal team sent you an offer regarding this property." I walked towards him, wiping the dust from my hands onto my jeans. "Yes, I got it." "Excellent," he said, his smile widening. He stepped inside, his polished shoes looking absurdly out of place on the old wooden floor. He glanced around, his eyes taking in the space with a dismissive sweep. "As you can see, it's quite the project. The demolition order is already in place. We're prepared to handle all of that, of course. Our offer of $5,000 is quite generous, considering the town will likely charge you for the demolition costs if you let it fall to them." He was a shark, circling. He saw a grieving widow in a dusty old building and smelled an easy deal. A week ago, he would have been right. I would have been intimidated, overwhelmed, and I would have signed anything to make him go away. But I wasn't that person anymore. "The offer is no longer on the table," I said. My voice was steady, much to my own surprise. Mr. Davison's smile faltered. "I'm sorry?" "I'm not selling," I said, crossing my arms. "I'm keeping it. I'm going to restore it." He actually laughed, a short, sharp bark of disbelief. "Restore it? Ma'am, with all due respect, this building was condemned for a reason. The foundation is questionable, the roof needs replacing, the whole structure needs to be brought up to modern code. We're talking about a 6-figure investment, minimum. You have less than 80 days to do it, or the town takes it anyway." He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "Take the $5,000. It's a win-win. You walk away with cash in your pocket, and we take this problem off your hands." I thought of Liam's letter. I chose to bet on you. I thought of Arthur's journal. I would rather be a fool who protects a single beautiful thing. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Davison," I said, walking to the door and holding it open. "But my answer is no." His face hardened, the fake charm evaporating completely. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice cold. "We have a vested interest in this entire valley. That 90-day deadline is firm. We'll be waiting." He turned and walked away without another word, his angry footsteps crunching on the gravel. I closed the heavy doors and slid the bolt home. The sound echoed with finality. I had just declared war. It was a terrifying, exhilarating feeling. I had no idea how to fix a foundation or replace a roof. I had no idea how to fight a town council or a development company. But I had $100,000, a workshop full of tools, and a purpose. For the first time since Liam died, I felt a surge of real, unadulterated hope. I spent the rest of the day making a plan. I used a small portion of the cash to buy a cheap, pay-as-you-go phone and a laptop. I sat in the office and started researching. I looked up local contractors, building codes, historical preservation societies. I read about zoning laws and how to appeal a condemnation order. It was a mountain of information, overwhelming and complex, but I tackled it one search at a time. My first official act was to hire a structural engineer to assess the building. He was a local man named George, with a kind face and hands as rough as sandpaper. He spent a full day tapping on beams, crawling under the foundation, and climbing onto the sagging roof. I held my breath the entire time, expecting a death sentence for the building. His final verdict was surprising. "She's built like a fortress," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "The man who built this used old-growth timber you couldn't even buy today. The foundation is solid stone, settled deep. The roof is a mess, and the wiring and plumbing will need a full replacement, but the bones are strong. It's not a teardown, it's a restoration." He gave me a quote that was high, but not impossible. The money in the strong box would cover it, with some left over. The next step was the town council. I submitted a formal appeal of the condemnation, including the engineer's report and a preliminary plan for restoration, which I'd paid a local architect to help me draft. I was terrified, but Mr. Thorne, the lawyer from the city, helped me navigate the paperwork. He seemed quietly impressed by my decision, and his professional reserve had been replaced by a genuine, if understated, support. While the bureaucratic wheels turned, the real work began. I couldn't do it all myself. I hired George's contracting crew to handle the big structural jobs, the new roof, the foundation reinforcement. While they worked on the outside, I worked on the inside. I started by carefully packing away all of Arthur's tools and half-finished projects, labeling everything, preserving his workspace exactly as he'd left it. I cleaned and oiled the beautiful strange lathe. I repaired the broken window panes and stripped the old peeling paint from the frames. The town was watching me. Every trip to the hardware store or the diner was met with curious stares and hushed conversations. The story of the city widow trying to save the old Vance place had become local legend. Some, like Jeb, were supportive, offering advice and discounts on supplies. Others were skeptical, convinced I was a fool who'd been tricked by the developers. The owner of the diner, a woman named Martha, started saving me a hot meal at the end of each day. "You can't rebuild on an empty stomach," she'd say, pushing a plate of meatloaf or chicken pot pie across the counter. Slowly, I was becoming part of the town's fabric. They saw me covered in sawdust and paint, unloading lumber from my car, my face smudged with dirt, but my eyes bright with determination. I wasn't just an outsider anymore. I was the keeper of the Vance workshop. And as the new roof went on, as the building began to look less like a ruin and more like a home, the town's skepticism began to morph into a grudging respect, and then into a quiet, collective pride. They were starting to see what I saw, not a derelict building, but a piece of their own history worth saving. The day of the town council meeting arrived. Mr. Davison was there, looking smug, flanked by 2 lawyers. I stood up alone, my notes trembling in my hand, and I told them Arthur's story. I told them about his work, his love for the town, and his desire to protect something beautiful from a world that had forgotten how. I told them about Liam and his final wish. I didn't talk about money or property values. I talked about legacy. When I finished, the council chamber was silent. The chairman, a stern-faced old farmer, looked from me to Mr. Davison. Then he looked at the dozen or so townspeople who had shown up to watch, including Jeb and Martha. He cleared his throat.
All those in favor of rescinding the demolition order and granting a 1-year probationary extension for the restoration of the Vance property? Every hand on the council went up. Mr. Davison's face went pale with fury. He and his lawyers packed their briefcases and stormed out. A small cheer went up from the back of the room. Martha gave me a huge, reassuring wink. I had won. We had won. Walking out of that meeting, with the sun on my face, I felt 10 feet tall. I had faced down the system, and for the first time in my life, I had come out on top. The victory at the town council meeting was a turning point. It wasn't just a legal reprieve. It was a moral one. The town of Havenwood had, in its own quiet way, chosen legacy over profit. They had sided with the ghost of an eccentric clockmaker and a determined widow over the slick promises of a development company. The news spread quickly.
The next day, when I went to the hardware store, Jeb refused to let me pay for a gallon of primer. Towns decided this project is an investment, he said with a gruff nod. You're doing us a favor, miss, reminding us what this place is about. That small gesture opened a floodgate. People started showing up at the workshop. An old electrician offered to help me rewire the whole building for the cost of materials alone. A retired plumber spent a week helping me install new pipes. A group of women from the local church came by with sandwiches and thermoses of hot coffee, and then stayed to help me sand and refinish the original wooden floors. The restoration was no longer my solitary project. It had become a community effort. With the structural work complete and the building safe and sound, I could finally turn my attention to the heart of the workshop, Arthur's legacy. I carefully unpacked his creations from the strongbox. Handling them felt like handling sacred objects. The miniature orrery, the clockwork bird, a dozen other small, miraculous devices. Each one was a testament to a mind that saw the world in a fundamentally different, more beautiful way. I also found his detailed blueprints and design journals. They were filled with sketches and calculations for inventions he had never had the time to build. A clock that kept time with the phases of the moon. A music box that composed its own melodies based on atmospheric pressure. A self-adjusting lens for a telescope. It was a treasure trove of forgotten genius. I knew I couldn't keep these things hidden. They didn't belong in a box. They belonged to the world. But I also knew I had to honor Arthur's fear of commercialization. His work couldn't be mass-produced. It had to be shared. I decided to turn the main floor of the workshop into a museum, a working exhibit dedicated to the art and science of Arthur Vance. The loft would be my small, private living space. The community rallied behind the idea with even more enthusiasm. Jeb helped me build beautiful, simple display cases from reclaimed wood. Martha organized a town-wide painting bee to finish the interior walls. The local librarian, a history enthusiast, helped me research Arthur's life, digging up old newspaper clippings and photographs, fleshing out the story I had learned from his journal. We discovered he had been a quiet philanthropist, using his skills to fix town clocks and farm equipment for free, never asking for anything in return. He wasn't just an eccentric. He was the town's quiet, brilliant soul. As the museum took shape, I began to feel a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. The workshop, once a symbol of my grief and uncertainty, was now a place of purpose and connection. The rhythmic work of sanding, painting, and building was a balm. And at night, I would climb the stairs to the loft, which was now a cozy apartment with a bed, a small kitchen, and a comfortable armchair. From the window, I could see the lights of Havenwood twinkling in the valley, and I felt a profound sense of belonging. I was home. The grand opening of the Havenwood Clock and Automaton Museum was on a crisp, clear day in early autumn, almost a year to the day after I had first arrived. The entire town turned out. People who had been skeptical at first now looked on with pride, pointing out the part of the floor they had sanded or the window they had glazed. Mr. Thorne drove up from the city, his usual melancholy expression replaced by one of genuine, amazed delight. I stood at the entrance, welcoming everyone. I wasn't rich in the way Mr. Davison would understand. Most of the money from the strongbox had been poured back into the building itself, into materials and wages for the contractors. But standing there, surrounded by a community that had embraced me, in a building that I had brought back to life, I felt like the wealthiest person on earth. I had inherited something far more valuable than money. I had inherited a purpose. Later that evening, after the last of the visitors had gone, I sat alone in the quiet museum. The moonlight streamed through the tall windows, glinting off the brass and steel of Arthur's creations. I walked over to the display case holding the little clockwork bird. I pressed the small lever, and it whirred to life, flapping its delicate wings, its tiny, perfect movements a testament to its creator's genius. I thought of Liam's letter. Live. Please, just live. I was. I was living more fully and more deeply than I ever had before. My grief for him was still there, a quiet ache in my heart. But it was no longer a weight that threatened to drown me. It had become a part of me, a source of strength, a reminder of a love so powerful it could reach across death to give me a second chance. The workshop wasn't an inheritance of property. It was an inheritance of character. Arthur had left a legacy of integrity and patience. Liam had left a legacy of faith and love. And now, it was my turn to build my own. The museum was just the beginning. I had started taking online courses in mechanical engineering and art preservation. I was learning to maintain and even repair Arthur's complex creations. I was becoming the apprentice he never had. The story of the workshop spread. A reporter from a regional paper wrote a feature story. It got picked up by a national magazine. Curators from larger museums came to visit, marveling at Arthur's work. They made huge offers to buy the collection, but I always politely refused. The collection belonged in Havenwood, in the building where it was born. What I had found in the walls of that workshop wasn't just money or priceless artifacts. I had found a connection to a family I never knew. I had found a community that had become my own. And in the process of rebuilding a broken-down building, I had rebuilt my own broken life. It turns out that sometimes the most valuable treasures are not the ones you find, but the ones you build. Home isn't a place you're given. It's a place you create with your own two hands, surrounded by people who believe in the same beautiful, impossible things that you do. You know, when I first arrived in Havenwood, I felt completely alone. I thought my story was one of endings, the end of a marriage, the end of a home, the end of a life. But Arthur and Liam taught me that some things don't end. They just wait. They wait for someone to come along who is willing to look past the dust and the decay, to see the strength in the bones of a place or a person. This journey taught me that inheritance isn't about what's left to you, but what's left in you. We all have a legacy, a story that was written long before we were born. And we all get to choose what to do with it. Do we cash it in for a quick and easy profit? Or do we take on the hard work of restoration, of honoring the past while building a new future? Maybe you're at a crossroads like that in your own life. Maybe you've been handed something that looks like a burden, a derelict building of your own, a failed business, a broken relationship, a painful memory. It's so easy to listen to the Mr. Davisons of the world, the ones who tell you to tear it all down and take the easy money. But I'm here to tell you that the bones might be stronger than you think. The treasure might be hidden inside the walls, waiting for you to do the work, to solve the puzzle. What I built here in Havenwood isn't just a museum. It's a testament to second chances. It's proof that the most profound wealth isn't something you can deposit in a bank, but something you build in your heart and in your community. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to rebuild your life from the ground up, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Your stories matter. They are the blueprints for how we all learn to be more resilient, more hopeful. Thank you for walking this road with me. If you believe in the power of stories like this one to remind us of what truly matters, consider subscribing to the channel. We're building a community here, a place for people who know that sometimes you have to go through the dark to find the light. And there's always light to be found.